Hello, this is Kim Anderson, and this is another talk about birth rates. This talk is going to be about women's empowerment in general. Now, I've gone over a number of issues already, especially the issue of women's education and its relationship to birth rates. But there are a lot of other factors in gender that also influence women's power in society and also influences or doesn't influence how many children they end up having. And this is an issue that has been promoted and focused on since the 90s, since the population conference in Cairo. And at that time, which I believe was 1994, there was a big shift away from talking about overpopulation. And I think that this has been really, really damaging for the discussion because I think this is the most important issue on the planet. I don't think there's any other environmental or social issue that is more crucial than understanding our ecological niche as human beings. So shutting down this conversation has been really harmful. And it's been shut down in, I think, some of the worst ways possible. And that's by associating it falsely with sexism and racism. This is really an issue of ecology. And if we want to look at it purely from the social perspective and from the gender perspective, we need to take a look at those statistics again. And of course, that's what I'm going to be looking at. So I'm going to look at some other measures of gender equality and gender roles. Today, I'm not going to go over contraception because that is a huge conversation that deserves a lot more in-depth analysis. But what I want to look at is issues of income, labor, and politics. I'm just going to go over some of the charts showing these different statistics, showing how unrelated different types of women's power is in different countries. And the fact is, we measure our power and our status very differently. And we all make very different choices. We all make different decisions based on subjective and also cultural ideals. So the main argument that we need to kind of put to rest is the idea that it's only really poor, uneducated people that have large numbers of children. This is a huge demographic shift. The fact is that that group is actually seeing the largest descent in their birth rate, and the largest ascent in birth rates are the people who have a lot of money and education. These are results that I got from Statistics Canada from 2018. I couldn't find them again online, but luckily I did take these numbers down from back then. And basically, this is a breakdown of different families and how many parents they have and how many children they have and what their average income is. Now, the reason I didn't use a global comparison for income is that I just personally feel that the difference in currency from one country to another just makes it too difficult to make a really good comparison. However, within a country, I do think that it is very good to be able to look that up. What we've got here is a breakdown of these different families. Now, this blue line here is the household income, and I broke that down into a per person income as well, just to make the comparison. And what we have here is two-parent families. These households have two parents. These households are single parents, which is why the household and the per person income is the same here. Now, for two parents, we've got 0 children. Their income, you can see here, is fairly low, right? It's lower than the one child, two parents. And that one also is lower than two child, two parents. We can see very clearly that the highest average income is 2 children, 2-parent household. It's also the most common. Because Statistics Canada only included 3+, they didn't break down any of those different numbers of children. 3 plus is in one category. So you can see pretty clearly 3 children is below the 2-child average. However, it is above the 1-child average, and it's definitely above the 0-child average. So already you can see here that the idea that it's poor people that are having the most children really does not get any confirmation from the actual numbers, especially recent numbers. So clearly, a couple with no children is kind of living within their means if they have no children, and that seems to be exactly the case. Now, because we don't know the breakdown of the 3 plus children, we can't really say exactly which direction this is going, but the stereotypical poor parents with many children, you may find them somewhere in here, but it's pretty clear that their average income is still pretty high, especially compared to the average of the other groups. Now, this is the single parent breakdown. We've got a single parent with 1 child, single parent with 2 children, and single parent with 3 plus children. And we see the exact same scenario as we do over here. A single parent with 1 child has the lowest income, 47,000 and a half. And then we see 51 and a half for the 2-child, 1-parent household. And then we see this number, 48,600, right? So this is higher still than the 1-child family, but it is lower than the 2-child family. So we're seeing in both cases, single parents and 2 parents, that the 2-child families have the highest average income in their group. Now, I broke this down per person just to see the difference. And you can see over here, which is quite interesting, is that the 0-child 2 parents have an even lower average per person income than any of the single parent with children group. Now, again, the way the statistics were, they didn't give a total average income for those single people without children. We couldn't get a good comparison between a single person without children compared to the couples without children. But you can see very clearly that this group is basically living within their means. Now, of course, the household income with 2 parents is significantly higher than the household income for a single parent, right? So overall, the people in this group are probably maybe a little better off because they have each other to count on. But if anybody has lived alone or with a couple, you know that the more income you have personally does make a big difference. Couples, whether it's roommates or married couples or whatever, don't actually save that much money by living together beyond like a mortgage or rent. And that's just one of those major flaws in our society, in our culture, that there's this weird assumption that you're saving massive amounts of money by living with another person, but the reality is not so much. So it's definitely showing that in a country like Canada, with free abortion, with available contraception, with a relatively free society, again, we do have public health care. You see that people are actually living within their means. They're not necessarily pushing outside of it as much as we want to think. So this confirms a lot of the other things that I have been finding out, that in fact, we really need to get beyond this stereotype that maybe we've had 30, 40 years ago, that it's just poor, uneducated people that are having the most kids. As you can see from this income chart, that the richest people seem to have 2 children on average, and maybe even a little bit more. Now, the issue of labor and political power are very interesting because they don't correlate to those other issues as much as you would think. The issue of women in government and education, like these 2 issues, if you take a look at them, you'll find there's hardly any correlation at all. Okay, so this graph shows very clearly very little correlation between the number of women in parliaments across the world and the female population with some secondary education. This line here is the political power, the number of women in the government. This line here is education. You can see the slightest difference. The lowest of the lows are down here. The highest for political power aren't necessarily even at the top. You can see a lot of these lines at 100%, kind of just across the board. I mean, this is about as random as you can get with just a slight influence that you might be able to deduce from this. So this is just showing that different measures of women's power are not equal. They don't always happen together. So the idea of women's empowerment doesn't necessarily directly correlate with education. And one of the biggest things that we need to understand is that a lot of women are very pronatalist. Not only that, but a lot of women are very patriarchal. They may not necessarily see themselves as patriarchal because they've been indoctrinated with patriarchy. And because patriarchy associates itself with so many other cultures, that a lot of people just see it as their culture. They don't really understand that patriarchy is a separate aspect of culture. Although both matriarchy and patriarchy are pronatalist, they're both named after mothers and fathers. The fact is that the difference between these two and the difference with gender roles is that in patriarchy, women's only role is to be a mother for the most part. But the fact is that the majority of the world's cultures and religions are today patriarchal, and especially those cultures that are in power in the government. And that includes women in the government. Now, there have been a lot of different policies that have been put in place to promote having more women in the government. And so there's been a shift in the last 10, 20, 30 years. And so sometimes there are places now that may not have had a lot of women in the government in the past, and today they are there. However, just because a woman gets into the government doesn't mean that she's going to stop having children. In fact, what we've seen is a lot of the opposite, is that we see women win positions of power in the government and then have a child directly after. And not only that, but some of the loudest voices of pronatalism have been from women politicians. And one of the number one things that they will do is to try to push more maternity leave. Maternity leave, of course, is extremely important for women who want to be able to have kids and then continue with their career afterwards. So you see that just because women get into power does not mean that they're going to promote any sort of antinatalist agenda, nor will they necessarily try to influence women to have less children. So this shows, this blue line here is the share of seats in parliament. We've got 0 at the bottom at Papua New Guinea, and we've got the highest at the top here, 55.7 in Rwanda. And this just shows you how wildly different the crude birth rate can be in comparison to this. So this is the crude birth rate by 1,000, right? So you can see highest crude birth rate here in Niger, which is in the lower end, below 20% in parliament. So we're seeing a rough correlation with some of these high birth rates, but again, we're also seeing the low birth rates. The low birth rate here, this is South Korea. So think about that. I mean, South Korea, the lowest birth rate, is right next to Niger, the highest birth rate, and they barely have any difference in the political power of women in those countries. So this just confirms what I've been saying, is that inequality between the sexes can increase or decrease the birth rate when you compare it to other issues on the table. And as we can see, there's not a lot of correlation going on at all with these crude birth rates and the political power of women. We're seeing the highest here, but the birth rates are still a pretty wide range. So overall, if we were to do kind of a line through it, you could see there's a bit of a wave, but the wave is going up and down, seeing a little bit of that U curve. Often powerful women do want more children, and they're trying to make it easier to have more children. So a lot of modern day feminism isn't associated with low birth rate at all, although it's often associated with the idea that you can choose not to have children. But pro-choice isn't necessarily counter to pronatalism either, because if it's a choice, then that's completely individual. That means that you can choose to do whatever you want. You can choose to have 10 kids, 15 kids. They simply don't care. And they'll assume, oh, but a woman who's getting more educated won't want that. It's simply not the case. A lot of those women with the high degrees, with high status, also see children as another high status issue. So they will want those children to show off the status, to show off the extra money they have, to show off the extra education they have, because now they're able to better educate their children. They can send them all to college. When you look at income and labor, and of course, those aren't exactly the same thing. A lot of people labor for very little money. However, men, especially at the highest levels of income and labor, tend to also have much higher numbers of children. And that's kind of happened for a long time. This is a classic patriarchal narrative where the men are the breadwinners and the providers, and they're expected to go out and make a living and bring back the money in order for the children to be fed and clothed and so on. And often what you also see in this classic patriarchal high status marriage is women with a high education who doesn't work at all, who is a stay-at-home mother and often has other helpers or servants. At one point, it would have been slaves as well to help her with the work of the children and keeping up the household. Okay, so this graph is showing gender differences in both labor and education. So these categories are crude birth rate categories. We've got lowest crude birth rate over here, 0.5 to 1, and this is by 100, and we've got 4 to 4.6 up here as the highest. And I just looked at what the basic difference between labor and education were between men and women. And this shows pretty clearly how very different the labor gender differences are compared to the education gender differences. So the biggest difference in men and women, over 30% here in labor, is that one of the lower birth rate numbers, right? As we see, the most equal labor between men and women is actually a very high birth rate, 3.5 to 4. On the other hand, the education differences look very, very different. The lowest differences in education are here, 1.46, here 1.5. So this is 2 to 2.5, which is roughly correlated to what we would call the replacement rate, but this is the crude birth rate and not the fertility rate. Anyhow, we're seeing that this area here is clearly where there's the least difference between men and women. And at the same time, we're seeing the greatest difference in labor. So this is showing very, very different lifestyles that involve both labor and education. But it's clear that the lower end of the birth rates show a larger disparity between labor in comparison to education, whereas the highest birth rates show a relatively lesser difference between labor and a greater difference between education. So the issues of labor and income as well are very important to look at. Now, if you look at women's labor and the birth rate, it's pretty much a direct U curve. So the highest fertility are seen at the lowest and highest levels of labor. Now, some of the highest birth rate areas in the world have a very high level of female labor. Okay, so this chart shows the relative difference in gender labor participation. I found the relative difference. So the difference in participation between men and women in labor in relation to the total level of labor, because of course you see wildly different numbers in different countries. So the relative difference showed this particular pattern, which I found to be really interesting. You can see that it's got a wave pattern going on. So this side here is showing the negative numbers. So these countries, and there are only two of them, show the countries where women actually have a higher level of labor participation than men. And that's Rwanda and Burundi. Over here, we have the highest level of male participation in relation to female participation in labor, right? So here's 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, so 60 to 85% difference between men and women across here. This line here has to do with the birth rate. Now, I've got two numbers here just to kind of show the difference. It's something I want to keep bringing attention to, that there is a crude birth rate, which often gets ignored in the media, as opposed to the total fertility rate, which is only for women, which is a complex formula, as I've said before. The total fertility rate does tend to relate to the actual number of children. Crude birth rate, on the other hand, is more of a percentage, and I've used it by 100 as opposed to by 1,000, which is often shown as. And you can see how close these numbers are, but they are slightly different, and I just want to bring attention to that because, of course, we're dealing with gender differences here. So, of course, we should be paying attention to the crude birth rate as it measures the total population, regardless of gender, in relation to how many children are born in a year. So, what this means is that even when women work a lot, and when people work a lot, like this is a pretty big difference up here. You can see this is the highest birth rate and the highest total fertility rate of all of these. And these are the countries where women are working the most. And then as we get down here, this is close to equal. So between 0 to 10% difference between men and women working. So we're seeing that it comes down as men's work starts to get higher than women's. We're seeing the very lowest birth rates and total fertility rate right here, which is a 10 to 20% difference. So men working just a little bit more than women. And as that number gets up, we see that it increases quite a bit. Now, what's interesting here, the difference between total fertility rate is that it's at its highest here with a 40 to 60% difference in favor of men working more than women. And the crude birth rate, 2.2 on average here, and it's 2.25, so it's just going right off the screen. So this is just slightly higher. So we're seeing a pretty direct correlation here as these numbers come down and they come back up again. Now, the reason that these aren't totally equal, so 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, and then we've got 40 to 60. And that's just because there's so few countries at this top end, 60 to 85 here. There's so few countries, but their numbers are really, really high. And we can see that this is also where the concentration of these very high birth rates is. But this crude birth rate would go straight up, whereas the total fertility rate actually starts to show a wave. So it's interesting to look at because, again, the total fertility rate is only women and the crude birth rate is the total population. So what we're seeing is that as men start to work more, the birth rate tends to go up. But as women also work more, the birth rate also goes up. Okay, so here's another look at the labor force participation. In this case, I have done the comparison for every 5 years. So we've got numbers from 1990 to 2020, every 5 years. And I've got here both female and male labor participation separately. And the way that I've broken this down, these different colors are the lowest crude birth rate. This is a crude birth rate by 1,000. So it's 5 to 15. Then we've got 15 to 25, 25 to 35, 35 to 45, and 45 to 55 right here. So these are the different crude birth rates and just showing what the level of labor participation is here. So this is 90%. You can see the percentage of labor force participation in these different countries. So I've averaged all the countries of the world for these numbers. And just to point out, like you can see here in 2020, there were no 45 to 55 countries represented at all. So that's why that blue line isn't even there. So these are female, male. This is female, male 1990, female, male 95, and so on. So we've got both of these together. You can see pretty clearly the difference between the female lines and the male lines. And again, this is the percentage of the population that is working. So overall, right away, you can see that males are working a lot more than females. These down here are the female lines, these are the male lines. Another interesting thing to look at, just from an overall perspective, if you look here at the female line, you can see some of those lines rising a little bit above here, almost to 60%, none of them going above 60%. And you can see the lower level here is around 40. None of them are going below 40 of any of these lines. So what we're seeing is some stabilization overall with women working. However, look at the male line. You can see that this male line is going down. And so this has to do with the fact that we don't have as many jobs, and therefore there are not as many people working globally as there has been in the past. And this is a major, major problem with overpopulation, where we see that as the population increases, the unemployment rate also increases. Not just unemployment, but the unemployment rate. And if you have an unemployment rate that's increasing along with the population increasing, that's an exponential increase in unemployment globally. So that's one of the concerning things that sort of goes beyond gender. We can argue all day about who should work and who shouldn't work, but the fact is, if there is no work because we're getting more and more robots to do work for us, this is something that needs to be looked at in a lot more detail because it affects everybody's labor regardless of gender. Now, the other thing to look at here is that all of these female lines tend to follow a pretty consistent pattern, which is a U curve. This one's a little off with the U curve. You see that this high level of birth rate at the top level is kind of shrinking this year. But if you look at it overall, you'll see that that level has been coming down and then it disappears entirely in this 2020 set of statistics. So this is consistent, right? And you see this in the other graph that shows only female labor. It is pretty consistently a U curve with the highest birth rates and the highest labor participation directly connected. So basically, the more that women work at the highest levels, the more children they have. And the basic rationale behind that would simply be that women are, at least in part, paying for their own children through their own labor. Now, on the other hand, the male lines up here are a little bit more different. For the most part, what you see in the male lines is something like this, where the highest labor and the highest birth rate go together up to a point, right? So if people are having children, you're going to assume that somebody's paying the bills. And in the most traditional gender segregated societies, it's often the men. But you can see that that's changing with time too. And you see that actually this moves away to something more of a U curve, where you're seeing actually higher levels of labor participation in the lower birth rate categories. So the lowest birth rate is pretty consistently low, which means it could be part of the reason why men aren't having children is because they don't have employment. And then they start to have more children as they gain a bit more employment. And you see that second line really taking off and getting higher. But look at this is 2020. So here we're seeing pretty consistently a return to the high birth rate, high labor scenario. But if you look at all these, I mean, there is a lot of variation, right? We're seeing that shift and change over time. But in general, what we see is that People that work more tend to have more children, or conversely, people with more children tend to work more in order to pay for the kids. We don't want to assume the direction of causality with this particular correlation. When you have overpopulation and you have population expansion, as we've had for the last few centuries, every class of people increases, and that rich upper class lifestyle has increased. And now it's being even more outsourced and globalized and economically ingrained, using especially artificial reproduction, surrogacy, which is just using handmaids to use their body and then push them away after and take the child. So we're seeing all kinds of accommodation for pronatalism and for people who want kids. A lot of the statistics that I have been going over are really based on physical measurables. Because I see that's when you really see kind of the result and the facts about what's going on. You do need the narrative though, and you need the emotion behind that. And there's certainly a very, very high level of emotion when it comes to having children. It's potentially one of the most, you know, feelings based decisions that a lot of people make. You know, people have to stop being so emotional when they discuss population. This is really a scientific issue. We are one species. If we are to be an intelligent species that survives on this earth, we need to know our limitations, or we're going to lose so much. And our quality of life will go down so much if we lose wild areas, if we lose wild species. I mean, it's really, really sad. I mean, I live in a country where we get to appreciate some of our wild areas, but they're not being kept up that much. And there's a lot of people ready to sacrifice all of that to make more for humans only. And I just really see this as a terrible, terrible direction. And we only have to look at the highest populated areas in the world to see where that's headed. And it's clear that that will lead to very, very high levels of pollution, a lot of litter and garbage everywhere. We now have massive garbage islands in the oceans. There's just too much garbage. And it's definitely true that we need to change the economic system. But the fact is that the population is what feeds that economic system. And if we want a better economic system, we have to have a lower population. That's just necessary. So it doesn't matter what issue you look at. The fact is that a high population will make virtually every problem worse. Even something that you would think is an environmental, like taking public transportation instead of using your own personal vehicle. Like, yeah, in some ways that does make more sense. There's less impact of 100 people taking a bus than 100 people taking their own vehicle. However, there's a lot less impact of 10 people taking their own vehicle than the whole bus. You see what I mean? So 10 people traveling in a place of 100 people is still going to have less environmental impact than a high number. So even something like public transportation depends on a mass population to move around. So all of the environmentalism that's connected to urbanization still has the dark side. It's still an overuse of resources. It's still treating people like cattle rather than individuals who could potentially have more freedom if we had less people overall competing for the same resources. So I feel like I have to kind of go a little bit into that overpopulation discussion directly, even though I'm aiming these talks to people that already understand and believe in overpopulation. The fact is it's an uphill battle because there's so many people that don't believe in overpopulation and that actually believe that we're becoming underpopulated and that we need more births. So if we come back to, we've looked at power and women's power and how women in power don't actually promote a lower birth rate at all. Often they're promoting the opposite, both on the left wing and the right wing. and often will go right ahead and have a child right away in power. I'm not really sure why they're doing that so much. I'm not sure if it's a power move in and of itself to prove that they can have a child whenever they feel like it. I think pushing women to do everything all at once doesn't make a lot of sense because there's only 24 hours in a day and you only have so much energy. And even if we are in a culture and a country where we have a high level of healthcare, I don't think that's a good reason to abuse that healthcare and to overuse it when you don't actually need it. So I think that's a step in the wrong direction. So these numbers here are based on the crude birth rate, lowest crude birth rate, and then the next going up in these line here. So you can see that these numbers also relate to those different crude birth rates. So we've seen the youth already in the labor force for women. We've seen it look a little bit different for men. This here is the secondary education. We've also seen this where we see lowest and highest with a lot of variation in the middle, both for females and males. And what's interesting here is the share of seats in parliament. So this is a percentage of women in parliament. We've got the highest level at the lowest birth rate, and then we've got the next highest in the highest birth rate. So another U curve, similar to the U curve here that we're seeing with labor, but in this case, the highest level is on the lowest level of the birth rate. But we're seeing not a very dramatic difference in the share of seats in parliament. And again, this is for 2021, and some of these statistics are a combination of the years before. So this chart is a list of the different combinations of seats in parliament, secondary education of women, and the women in labor force participation, right? You can see these statistics range from 2015 to 2019 with the birth rates in 2021. This is the number of countries in each of these categories. So basically the reason I did this is because this is something that I found a little interesting. I actually made a similar chart that I accidentally deleted that was just education and labor to show those differences. I did show another chart though that pretty much goes over what I found anyway, which is that these two numbers don't really correlate at all. And when you add in the parliamentary seats, which shows the political power of women in a country, it gets even a little more complicated. So in this chart, which I've basically divided all of these into 25 percentiles, so it's 4 categories for all of them. As you can see here, the share of seats in parliament, none of them are over, and we've only got 4 countries that are at 50 to 75%. This is the number of countries in each of these categories, and this is roughly where they are in the world. As you can see, some of them are pretty broad, like this group here, which was very low political power, very high secondary education, and a mid-range labor force participation, was just all over the world, and that was 20 countries. The other higher level ones, we've got 21, which is Europe, the Americas, and Oceania. And that's seeing a higher level of seats in parliament, 25 to 50%, a very high level of education, 75 to 100, and female labor force participation, 50 to 75, kind of in the middle. And this whole chart is organized by the crude birth rate. So I found the average crude birth rate and all these list of countries in these different categories. And we can see here from lowest to highest. And some of them are only one country. As you can see, Cuba and the United Arab Emirates are at the bottom here, followed by a very large group. And at the other end here, we've got 4 countries in the south of Africa, followed by Afghanistan, and then another 11 countries from Africa and Bhutan. So we can sort of see all the different ranges here and how complex this thing can look. Some of them are the same all across. Look at this is only one country, Bolivia, 50 to 75 in all 3 categories. Here we've got 0 to 25 in all 3 categories, which is Yemen, which is pretty consistently at the very bottom of every single gender equality marker that you can find. Yemen really falls to the bottom in almost every way that you look at it. And some of these you can see quite a range. Like look at this in the south of Africa. Very high labor force participation, very low education, but a mid-range of political power. Now look at this political power thing, because this is what kind of stands out. As we've gone over before, education is roughly the most correlated to the birth rate, which unfortunately gives it the impression that it is a direct cause and effect, which, as I've gone over, it is not direct cause and effect. It just is a higher correlation. However, over here, you can see less of a correlation going on, although, again, the highest levels of seats in parliament are correlated with the lowest birth rate categories here. But as you can see, the other two are quite a bit higher. They're at the higher level here. We've got Rwanda, we've got Bolivia, the UAE, and Cuba. Now, the situation in Rwanda is interesting. As you can see, there's also very high labor force participation, but very low education. Now, Rwanda saw a lot of political turmoils, and one of the outcomes of that was a shift in thinking and a greater desire at the top level to increase the power of women, which is why this political power is so high. And as you can see in the other categories, in the very highest birth rates here, you actually see not the lowest level of political power here. The lowest political powers are kind of in the mid ranges, right? And some of them are pretty extreme, like low level for political power, low level of education, but very high labor force participation, and that's in Cambodia. And their crude birth rate is right in the middle, right? So it's important to look at all these different factors. It's really easy to just say, oh, empower women and the birth rate will just automatically fix itself. Well, it's a lot more complicated than that, and we need to understand the nuance and complications of being human and what that means. And you can see here, highest levels of labor force participation. Again, these are in the highest levels of birth rate. You're seeing the extremes here. See down here, 25 to 50 and 50-75 dominate in the lower birth rates. And then you see the extremes, the lowest extreme and the highest extreme, right? So what that's showing is the difference between what men and women do leads to more extreme behaviors. And these are things that we have to take into account. Now, the influence of women in power who are trying to make it easier for other women to have children without it interfering with their income, unfortunately, are contributing directly to the rise in birth rate. And, I went over this issue before. I'm probably going to go into it a little bit more again, which has to do with the fact that not only is the birth rate not plummeting in a large number of countries, but there are a significant number of countries where the birth rate has rebounded, where it's actually higher than it was 10, 20 years ago. And a lot of those places are seeing their birth rates kind of fluctuate up and down. And we tend to hear about it when it goes down, but we don't hear very much about it when it goes up again. But it does. And the fact is that it isn't just disempowered women that are having those extra children again. It is women who want children, who are doing everything they can to have children, including using other women's bodies for the birthing process, for the eggs, for the early childhood care, for nannying throughout their lives. The rich lifestyle is in itself toxic to the environment by providing so much material wealth to a group of people who don't seem to have a high level of ecological or altruistic understanding of what it is they're doing and how much damage they're causing. And as overpopulation activists, we really need to understand that the cultural idea of pronatalism is the number one problem. And so we need to look at that in many different angles from men's perspective, from women's perspective, from non-gender conforming perspectives, from liberal perspectives, single people, couples. There's been way too much focus on the conservative heterosexual perspective, and there's been way too much conflation of what women are doing with what men are pushing them to do or what their parents are pushing them to do. And the idea that women, just by being women, are automatically going to be altruistic really isn't proving itself right now. I think what is proving itself is, in general, people's quality of life goes up when women have more power. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that the birth rate is going down. And I do think we very urgently need to have a reduction in birth rate, far, far, far under one child per person. And until we really start dealing with that issue directly, we're not going to see any big changes in population or birth rate. And not only that, but we need to also look at the fact that sometimes it's negative gender equality that leads to lower birth rate and not greater gender equality. The idea that women are just out to have a good time when they're actually running away from very real oppression and abuse is a very, very serious mistake to make. We need to stop making that mistake. So this is taken from the Pew Research Center, and they did a study in 2019 and did a survey asking people how important it was that women have the same rights as men in their country. So this was the question that was asked, and the response to this is if it's very important. So this is the number that I used from their survey, and I compared it with the birth rate. So this is the crude birth rate by 100 over here, 0 to 4, and this is the percentage. 100 is right here, and 0 is right here. So I just wanted to show this in a scatter graph form, and I'm going to show this also as a line graph so you can see the different countries and how they compare. So this was a really interesting look at this. It's pretty clear that as the number gets higher, it is definitely gathering towards the lower end of the birth rates. And we see at the very highest birth rates are also showing the very lowest level where they said that it's not very important. However, you got to look at this one and then also at this one. So this one is also showing a very similar level of importance, which is a lot of the people don't think that it's important that women have rights in their country. And that's seeing a difference in birth rate all the way up to the very highest birth rate and down to a much lower birth rate. And you can even see the difference here. So definitely there is a pretty strong correlation with somewhat lowered birth rates. However, they're not the lowest birth rates. And I think this is just confirming something that I've kind of been going over a lot, which is that the differences in gender are both correlated with a very high birth rate and also with the lower birth rate, right? This is the lowest birth rate here. And it's only slightly higher in terms of like how many people care about gender than these down here, right? So this is the thing, is that equality actually leads to a pretty normalized middle of the road birth rate. But any differences in gender can either increase the birth rate or they can decrease it. And we're seeing that pretty clearly, that this group of countries, which believes that the rights of women are extremely important, are gathered in the lower end of the birth rates, but not the lowest, which are actually down here. And you're also seeing some variation in these outliers over here. So again, it's important to understand what the effect of gender segregation and gender inequality really is. Okay, so this is the same Pew Research study from 2019. In this one, I've shown two answers to the question about whether it's important that women have the same rights as men in their country. So we've got the somewhat important line here, we've got the very important line here, and then I use these together. This is the total of the people who answered that it was important that women had the same rights as men in their country. This survey was done for 35 countries. So, not a huge sample, but still pretty interesting to see what this difference is. Now, I have just organized this in a line of crude birth rate. So, we've got the lowest crude birth rate over here, which is South Korea, and we've got the highest crude birth rate over here, which is Nigeria. So, these are organized in terms of low birth rate to high birth rate. And you can see pretty clearly that overall, the highest levels of importance that people give to gender equality are kind of in the mid range. So you see there is a bit of a dip here, and there's an even bigger dip over here. So as the birth rate gets into its highest levels, we generally see that there is less rights for women, or at least people in general don't think it's as important for women to have the same rights as men. And that correlates with the birth rate. And of course, there are some exceptions. And here we've got another dip in importance, although they did say somewhat important. So it's not saying that they're not important at all. You can see that there is a correlation, but at the same time, it's not consistent. So we can't necessarily rush to the conclusion that gender equality is the reason why people have less children, because it can go either way. It can either lead people to have less children, or it can lead people to have more children, depending on those other circumstances that are going on in those countries. So even as overpopulation activists, we need to understand that sometimes those low birth rates aren't happening for good reasons. So we need to really take a holistic view and understand that people need to have better health and well-being. And part of that includes having less children. And that goes for everyone, men and women, and those who are not in those categories. And there's no reason why anybody should be pressured into having children. So we need to look at and attack pronatalism. I'm not an antinatalist, but I am anti-pronatalist. I think pronatalism is very, very dangerous. The fact is that birth still causes enormous problems. The fact is that a lot of babies are being born now in situations where they are coerced and where they're very, very unhealthy. And if we put human health and well-being first, we're actually putting the health and well-being of other species first as well. And that comes from ecological understanding. So we need more ecology and less pronatalism. So I hope you enjoyed this talk about the birth rates. I'm going to continue with these talks. Also, take a look at my podcast. It's called The Never Ending Experiment. It's on all the different podcasting platforms. And I do go into issues of matriarchy and patriarchy and overpopulation in those as well. But this talk on YouTube is going to be about the birth rates until I get the end of what I have to say, which is still quite a bit. I'm still going over the gender issues. There are other things to look at, like migration, population density, and our ancient human past, which is very, very interesting. And as much as we like to think that it's ancient past, the fact is that it's still influencing our behavior today, as is where we live. And I don't just mean culturally, I mean geographically. So there's more issues to look at. So I hope you come back and keep watching the series. This is Kim Anderson. Thanks.